Peter Pan by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 1. Peter Breaks Through. All children except one grow up. They begin to know it after they are 2. And that was when Wendy Darling began to know it. The Darlings lived in London at number 14. Wendy was the oldest. Then came John and little Michael. Mrs. Darling loved her children and wanted everything just so. But Mr. Darling was always worried about money. So the children had a nurse. But the nurse was a huge dog named Nana. Nana's kennel was in the night nursery. She awoke at the slightest cry. Nana was a treasure, as Mr. Darling well knew. But sometimes he worried that the neighbors talked. Even worse, he worried that Nana did not admire him enough. Being admired was very important to Mr. Darling. The Darlings were a happy family. That is, until Peter Pan came. Mrs. Darling first learned of Peter when she was tidying up her children's minds. All good mothers do this after their children go to sleep. It is quite like tidying up drawers. Mrs. Darling tucked the bad thoughts down at the bottom. She folded the beautiful thoughts right on top, ready for her children to put on as soon as they awoke in the morning. Have you ever seen a map of a child's mind? Each one is different. But all of them are very confusing. A child's mind is a neverland. It is filled with skipping stones and chocolate pudding, verbs, and the first day of school. There are zigzag lines everywhere. Those are the roads on the Island. For the Neverland is always an Island. It has caves and pirates and lagoons and mermaids. And children are always at play on those magic shores. Mostly Mrs. Darling did not worry about what she found in her children's minds. But then she came across the word Peter. Who is Peter? Mrs. Darling asked Wendy the next day. You know, Mother, said Wendy. Peter Pan. At first Mrs. Darling did not know. Then she remembered a Peter who was said to live among the fairies. Perhaps she had even believed in him as a child. But now she was married and full of sense. So Mrs. Darling had put Peter out of her mind. A few nights later there were leaves by the nursery window. I do believe that Peter tracked them in, said Wendy. Mrs. Darling did not know what to think. The nursery was 3 stories up. 30 feet from the ground and no way to climb up. Mrs. Darling told Mr. Darling. Oh, it is just some nonsense Nana has put in their heads, said Mr. Darling. Leave it alone and it will blow over. But of course, it did not blow over. The next evening was Nana's night off. Mrs. Darling tucked the children into bed. Then she sat by the fire in the nursery to sew. Soon she fell asleep. But her dreams were troubled. She dreamed that the Neverland came too near. She dreamed that a strange boy broke through it. And she saw her children peeping through the gap. Suddenly the window of the nursery blew open. There was a boy dressed in a suit of leaves. He dropped to the floor like a cat. A strange light no bigger than your fist flew with him. It twinkled and darted about the room like a living thing. Mrs. Darling woke up with a scream. She knew at once that the boy was Peter Pan. He still had all his baby teeth. Nana had just come home. The scream brought her rushing into the nursery. She sprang at the boy. But he leapt through the open window. Mrs. Darling screamed again. Surely the poor boy had fallen to his death. She ran to the street. But his body was not there. She looked up into the dark night sky. All she saw was what looked like a shooting star. But Nana had caught something in her mouth. It was the boy's shadow. Nana knew the boy would come back for it. And she did not want him to upset the children. So she hung the shadow out the window. He could get it when he pleased and be on his way. But Mrs. Darling would not have that. It looked as if washing was hanging out the front window. What would the neighbors think? Quickly Mrs. Darling rolled up the shadow. Then she hid it in a drawer. She would have to tell Mr. Darling. But how? Chapter 2, The Children Are Left Unguarded. One night the Darlings were getting ready for a dinner party. Mrs. Darling went into the nursery to show Wendy her new gown. Suddenly Mr. Darling rushed in. "This tie won't tie," he thundered. Then Nana brushed against him. She got hairs on his new trousers. On top of everything, Michael would not take his medicine. "I always took my medicine without a fuss when I was a boy," said Mr. Darling. "Why, I would take my own medicine now to show you. But I've lost the bottle." In fact, Mr. Darling had hidden it. "I know where it is," cried Wendy. She quickly brought him the bottle. "Why don't you and Michael take your medicine together?" Mr. Darling did not like that idea one bit. But what could he do? Wendy counted 1, 2, 3. Michael took his medicine. But Mr. Darling hid his behind his back. "Oh, Father," cried Wendy. The children stared as if they no longer admired him. Even Mrs. Darling shook her head. Mr. Darling was embarrassed. Perhaps a good joke would make them respect him again. "Look," he said. "I'll pour my medicine into Nana's milk. Won't that be funny?" Mr. Darling called Nana to her bowl. The children tried to stop her. But Nana began to drink the milk. Suddenly she stopped. She looked up at Mr. Darling with tears in her eyes. Then she crept into her kennel. The poor dog! Mrs. Darling and the children ran to her side. Mr. Darling completely lost his temper. "I will not allow that animal to rule my nursery any longer," he shouted. "The proper place for a dog is in the yard." The children wept. Nana begged. But Mr. Darling wanted to show them who was master. He dragged Nana outside and chained her in the yard. Mrs. Darling put the children to bed. They could hear Nana barking out in the cold. Soon Mr. and Mrs. Darling stepped out into the snowy night. Their party was at number 27, just a few houses down. The stars watched till the door shut behind them. Then the smallest of the stars cried, "Now, Peter." Chapter 3, Come Away. Come away! A twinkling light darted into the nursery. It was a tiny fairy called Tinker Bell. Then the window blew open. Peter Pan dropped to the floor. "Tink," he whispered. "Do you know where they've put my shadow?" "In the chest of drawers," she said. The fairy's language was like the tinkling of golden bells. Peter jumped at the drawers. He dug through the nicely folded things. He tossed them over his shoulder left and right. There was his shadow. He slammed the drawer and shut Tinker Bell inside. Peter was surprised. Why didn't his shadow jump right back on him? He tried to stick it on with a bar of soap. But that didn't work either. Peter flopped to the floor and cried. The sound of his crying woke Wendy. Boy, she said politely. Why are you crying? Peter sprang to his feet. Who are you? Wendy Moira Angela, I am darling, she said. I am Peter Pan, said the boy. I was crying because my shadow won't stick. But I wasn't really crying. Wendy knew at once what to do. She took out her needle and thread. Then she sewed the shadow back on. Oh, Wendy, crowed Peter. One girl is worth 20 boys. Really, Peter? Wendy was so pleased, she offered to give him a kiss. Peter stuck out his hand. He clearly didn't know what a kiss was. Wendy did not want to hurt his feelings. So she gave him her thimble. Now shall I give you a kiss, too? He asked. If you please, said Wendy. Peter dropped an acorn button into her hand. Wendy sighed. I know what I'll do, she said. I'll put your kiss on a chain. Then I can wear it around my neck. That seemed to please Peter. How old are you? Wendy asked. Peter frowned. I don't know, he said. He didn't like questions that he didn't know the answer to. I ran away the day I was born. Really? Said Wendy. Why? I heard my father and mother talking, said Peter. They knew what I would be when I became a man. But I don't want to grow up. I want to be a boy and have fun forever. So I ran away to live with the fairies. Oh, Peter, cried Wendy. Tell me about the fairies. Would you, please? Peter smiled. He knew all about that. Fairies began long ago, he said. When the first baby laughed for the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces. The pieces all went skipping about. Each piece became a fairy. And that is how fairies began. There should be one for every girl and boy, he said. But sometimes a child says, I don't believe in fairies. Each time one does, a fairy dies. An angry shake of bells came from the chest of drawers. Why, I must have shut Tinker Bell up in the drawer, said Peter. He opened the drawer. The little fairy flew about the nursery. She was tinkling with fury. She's lovely, cried Wendy. Tink, said Peter. Would you like to be Wendy's fairy? Tinker Bell answered with an ngry jangle. Peter shook his head. She is not very polite, he told Wendy. She says, you are an ugly girl. And she says that she is my fairy. But she knows she can't be my fairy. After all, I am a gentleman and she is a lady. Tink flew off in a huff. Where do you live now? Wendy asked. With the lost boys, said Peter. Children who fall out of their carriages and are forgotten. I'm their captain. What fun, cried Wendy. Yes, said Peter. But we are very lonely. You see, we have no mothers. That's why I come to your window. To hear your mother tell stories. She was telling such a nice one. It was about a lady with a glass slipper. Oh, Cinderella, said Wendy. She and the prince live happily ever after. Peter leapt to the window. I must tell the other boys how it ended. Peter! Wendy cried. I know lots of stories. Peter stopped on the sill. He had a greedy look in his eyes. He pulled Wendy toward the window. "Come away with me and tell the other boys, too." Wendy was frightened. "Let me go. I can't fly." "Come away with me and I'll teach you," said Peter. "Wendy, there are mermaids there." "Really?" cried Wendy. Peter knew he almost had her. "You could tuck us in at night and mend our clothes. You could be our mother." That did it! Wendy ran to wake her. "Brothers, Peter Pan has come. He's going to teach us to fly." John and Michael were up and ready in a second. Peter blew fairy dust on them. "Wiggle your shoulders," he said. Soon they were all flying. Nana was barking wildly down in the yard. At last she broke loose and ran down the street to number 27. Mr. and Mrs. Darling rushed into the street. They looked up at the nursery window. It was filled with light. And they saw 4 flying shadows on the curtains. The Darlings might have reached the nursery in time. But the stars were watching. A young one blew open the window. "Hurry, Peter," it cried. Nana and the Darlings ran inside and up the stairs. They flung open the door to the nursery. But it was too late. The children were gone. Chapter 4: The Flight. Second to the right, and straight on until morning. That was the way to the Neverland, Peter said. But even birds with maps could not have found it that way. For you see, Peter just said whatever came into his head. Wendy, Michael, and John flew through the air in their night clothes. They followed Peter without Kay's tie-in. Sometimes it was dark. Sometimes it was light. And now they were flying far out over the sea. How long had they been gone? The children could not tell for sure. Finally Peter stopped. "There it is," he said. The children stood on tiptoe in the air to see. A million golden arrows pointed toward an island. It seemed so familiar. Like home after a long vacation. They flew toward the island. Then something seemed to push against them. The golden arrows disappeared. The island grew dark and unfriendly. "The pirates have spotted us," Peter said. "They'll see Tinker Bell's light," cried Wendy. "Tell her to put it out." "She can't," said Peter. "It only goes out when she falls asleep." But John had brought his tall black hat. Peter hid the fairy in that. Just then the pirates fired their cannon into the sky. The blast scattered the children across the darkness. Wendy found herself alone with Tink. It is important to understand one thing. Fairies are very small. They have room for only one feeling at a time. Sometimes it is all good. Sometimes it is all bad. Tinker Bell was so jealous of Wendy. She was filled with bad hateful feeling. From the tips of her wings to the tips of her toes. Tinker Bell darted this way and that. "Come with me to safety," she seemed to say. Wendy did not know that Tinker Bell hated her. So she followed the little fairy. Chapter 5: The Island Comes True. Down on the island the Neverland came to life. The Lost Boys were looking for Peter. The pirates were looking for the Lost Boys. And the Indians were looking for the pirates. But they were all going at the same speed. So they just kept going around and around the island. The boys were dressed in animal skins. There was Toodles, Nibs, Slightly, Curly, and the twins. They lived in a home under the ground. Each boy had his very own hollow tree for a secret entrance. That is how they hid from the pirates. "Look," cried Nibs. "There's Tinker Bell." The boys looked into the sky. Tink flew around what looked like a great white bird. But it was really Wendy in her long white nightgown. "Hurry!" shouted Tink. "Peter wants you to shoot the Wendy." The boys never questioned Peter's orders. Toodles raised his bow and arrow and fired. The arrow struck Wendy's chest. She fluttered to the ground. A terrible silence fell upon the woods. The lost boys crowded around Wendy. "This is no bird," said Slightly. He spoke in a scared voice. "I think it must be a lady." Suddenly they heard Peter crow to signal his return. "Great news, boys," he cried as he dropped to the ground. "I have brought you a mother." The boys shook with fear. "She is dead," Toodles cried. "From my arrow." Peter knelt by Wendy's body. "Look," he said. "The arrow struck this acorn button. It's my kiss. It saved her life." Golden bells shook above them. Tinker Bell was crying. She did not want Wendy to live. Then the boys told Peter what Tinker Bell had done. "Tink," cried Peter. "I am your friend no more. Leave me forever." Then he felt Wendy's hand upon his arm. "All right, not forever," Peter said. "But for a whole week." Then he turned back to Wendy. They were afraid to move her. But they could not leave her outside. "Let's build a house around her," said Peter. "If only we knew what kind of house she likes best," said Toodles. Wendy's eyes were still closed. But she suddenly began to sing. "I wish I had a pretty house, the littlest ever seen, with funny little red walls and roof of mossy green." The boys were delighted. They chopped down trees. They brought their underground things from houses. They put John's hat on top for a chimney. At last they were finished. Peter wiped his feet and knocked at the front door. Wendy opened it. The lost boys fell to their knees. "Oh, Wendy lady, be our mother," they begged. "I am just a little girl," said Wendy. "But I will do my best. Come inside then, you naughty children. I have just enough time to finish the story of Cinderella. Then I will put you all to bed." Chapter 6, Captain Hook. The pirates still crept through the night forest. What an evil gang they were! Yet even they trembled before their leader, the black-hearted Captain James Hook. Hook dressed in velvet and lace. He wore his hair in long black curls. And he had the speech and manners of a perfect gentleman. Except when he was running you through with his sword. Then his blue eyes burned. With 2 red spots. But that was not the worst of it. In place of his right hand was an iron hook. The captain paused among the trees and sighed. Such a beautiful night. Suddenly he felt like talking. "I know what I'd do if I were a mother," Hook told his mansme. "I would pray that my children be born with a hook." Yet it was the hook that made him hate Peter. "It was Pan who cut off my arm," Hook explained. "Then he fed it to a crocodile. The croc found me delicious. And it has followed me ever since." "In a way it's a compliment," said Smee. "I want no such compliments," barked Hook. "I want Peter Pan. He's the one who gave the croc its taste for me." Hook sat down on a large mushroom. That crocodile would have had me by now. But it swallowed a clock. Now it ticks. That warns me to run away. Some day the clock will run down, said Smee. Aye, that's the fear that haunts me, said Hook. And it's all Pan's doing. I've waited long enough. I want to shake his hand with this. He sliced the air with the deadly hook. Suddenly the captain jumped up. Odds bobs, hammer and tongs. This mushroom is hot. Hook and Smee looked at the thing. They pulled it loose. Smoke rose in the air. A chimney, they exclaimed. Then something else came out. The chatter of boys. The pirates had found the chimney to the home under the ground. Wendy had put the boys to bed. But they were far too excited to sleep. The captain's lips curled into a wicked smile. Back to the ship. We'll cook up a large rich cake. With thick green sugar on it. Then we'll leave it here where the boys will find it. He giggled. They have no mother. Don't you see? They won't know how dangerous it is to eat rich damp cake. They'll gobble it up. And die. Hook shook with laughter. Tick, 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 tick. The crocodile, gasped Hook.